In 1839, 35 people were loaded onto wagons in Detroit and hauled 2 days west into the Michigan wilderness. They were the poor, the sick, the unwanted. 111 others had refused to make the trip. They called the destination an awful wilderness. The place they arrived at was a converted stagecoach tavern on the road between Detroit and Chicago, called the Black Horse Tavern. It sat on 280 acres of empty farmland in Nankin Township. There was a log cabin for the keeper, an A-frame shack for the inmates, and a cookhouse out back where everyone, staff and residents alike, ate from the same pot. That was the beginning of Eloise. By the 1920s, those 280 acres had exploded into over 900 acres. That single log cabin had become 75 buildings. That handful of 35 residents had swelled to 10,000. Eloise had its own police department, its own fire department, its own railroad and trolley system, a bakery, a post office, a working farm with dairy cattle, a piggery, greenhouses, and a tobacco curing building. 16 kitchens produced 30,000 meals every single day. It was not a hospital. It was a city. A self-contained world with its own rules, its own economy, and its own cemetery. And once you passed through its gates, the outside world could forget you entirely. This is the story of the largest psychiatric complex in the United States and the 10,000 lives it swallowed whole. This is Ward Files. The Wayne County Poorhouse, as it was originally known, was never meant to treat the mentally ill. It was built to warehouse the destitute. If you were too poor to survive on your own, the county would put a roof over your head. In exchange, you worked the farm, you milked the cows, you grew the food that fed everyone, including the keeper and his family, and if you happened to lose your mind along the way, you stayed anyway. There was no distinction between the rational and the insane until March 22nd, 1841. That was the day the first psychiatric patient was officially registered. Her name was Bridget Hughes, an Irish immigrant. She would remain a patient at Eloise for the next 54 years until her death in 1895. Think about that number, 54 years. She likely arrived when the institution was still a handful of wooden shacks in the Michigan wilderness, and she died there long after it had become something enormous and unrecognizable. Her entire adult life spent inside the walls of a place that did not even have a name when she arrived. Bridget Hughes never left, and she was far from the last. In 1892, a devastating fire at the Eastern Michigan Asylum in Ypsilanti forced hundreds of patients to be relocated overnight. The county facility in Nankin Township absorbed them all, and that single event cracked open the floodgates. New wards were erected in 1893, then more in 1921, 1923, 1925, 1928, and 1929. Each expansion was supposed to solve the overcrowding. None of them did. The patients kept coming faster than the buildings could contain them. By 1913, the population had climbed to over 1,500, with a staff of just 22 men and 44 women to manage them all. That same year, the entire complex was officially renamed Eloise, after the young daughter of the Detroit postmaster who had helped establish a post office on the grounds back in 1894. A little girl's name, an innocent name. It would be stamped across admission papers, death certificates, and grave markers for the next 7 decades. And then came the Great Depression. When the economy collapsed, the people who lost everything had nowhere to go. The homeless, the jobless, the elderly, whose savings had evaporated, the mentally ill, whose families could no longer afford to care for them. They all ended up in the same place. By the early 1930s, Eloise held 10,000 residents and employed a staff of 2,000. The majority were not even psychiatric patients. They were infirmary cases, sick, poor, and abandoned people warehoused in a system that had never been designed to hold them. Imagine the scale of that for a moment. 10,000 human beings eating, sleeping, working, and deteriorating inside a single institutional complex. That is roughly the population of a small American town. And yet it appeared on no map as a city. Its residents had no vote, no voice, and in most cases, no visitors. They were simply there, absorbed into a system that had grown so large it had become its own sealed world, complete and closed off and entirely forgotten by the one outside its gates. But Eloise was not just a warehouse. That is what makes this story so much harder to tell. Eloise pioneered the use of X-rays for diagnosis. It was one of the first hospitals in America to do so. It housed Michigan's first kidney dialysis unit. It introduced music therapy into patient care decades before most institutions considered it. Medical students from Wayne State University and the University of Michigan trained within its wards. For some patients, Eloise was a genuine lifeline, the only place they could receive care that did not exist anywhere else in the region. And in those same wards, sometimes in the same rooms, doctors performed lobotomies, hammering surgical instruments through the skulls of patients to sever the neural pathways they believed caused madness. Electroshock therapy induced seizures that left patients unable to remember their own names. Hydrotherapy meant hours strapped in tubs of ice water. Insulin shock therapy meant deliberate overdoses that put patients into comas they sometimes never woke from. The same institution that saved lives also destroyed them, and the people on the receiving end had no say in which version of Eloise they got. One attorney who represented patients at Eloise, along with those at Pontiac State and Traverse City, described the conditions in a single phrase. He called them medieval dungeons, and many of the people inside those dungeons did not belong there. Women were routinely committed by their husbands for infidelity, disobedience, or excessive emotion. Masturbation was classified as a confinable mental illness. People with no psychiatric disorder at all were locked into wards alongside patients suffering from severe psychosis. Patient-on-patient violence was rampant. Supervision was almost non-existent. The sane and the suffering were thrown into the same pit, and the system that was supposed to protect them could not tell the difference between the two. But the psychiatric wards were not even the worst of it. Eloise did not only break minds, it also collected the DYing. The complex ran a tuberculosis sanatorium, and the people who ended up there had already exhausted every other option. At the dawn of the 20th century, tuberculosis was the leading cause of death in the United States. Eloise opened its sanatorium to treat these patients with what was then considered revolutionary open-air therapy, placing beds on open porches and pavilions in the belief that fresh air could slow the disease. But in his 1911 report, the facility's own Dr. Dutlitz wrote that incoming patients were in the last stage of consumption and were sent to Eloise when their personal funds were exhausted. Nothing was left but the poorhouse. The sanatorium operated from 1908 until 1923, when the state of Michigan and the city of Detroit finally opened their own facilities. By then, hundreds had already died within its walls, and when they died, many of them had nowhere to go. Which brings us to what may be the most disturbing part of this entire story. South of Michigan Avenue, off Henry Ruff Road, in what is now Westland, Michigan, there is a field bordered by pine trees. Between 1910 and 1948, over 7,100 patients were buried in that field. Their graves were marked with small concrete blocks. Each block had a number, no names, no dates, no epitaphs, just a number. The bodies came from every division of the complex: the infirmary, the general hospital, the tuberculosis sanatorium, the psychiatric wards. These were people whose families either could not afford a burial or never came back to claim the body. In the early years, other patients dug the graves. In the 19th century, the cemetery had also become a source for body snatchers. Medical students from the University of Michigan raided it for cadavers to use in dissection labs. Even in death, the people of Eloise were treated as raw material. After 1948, the practice of burial stopped entirely. Unclaimed bodies were no longer placed in the ground. They were sent directly to the Wayne State University College of Medicine. But the 7,000 already buried remained where they were. The records were almost non-existent. For the entire year of 1934, only 4 death records survived. 4 records for an institution housing 10,000 people. Thousands of human beings were placed into the earth, and the paperwork that might have told us who they were simply vanished. In December of 2015, a local man named John Burns decided to find out what was really under that field. He had grown up near Eloise and had heard the stories his entire life. Burns and 12 volunteers began uncovering the concrete markers, which had been buried under layers of dirt and sod over the decades. They found markers numbered into the thousands. Wayne County officials eventually told them to stop, citing liability concerns. One of the volunteers, Stacy Morgan, described uncovering the first marker in a way that has stayed with everyone who heard it. She said it was like letting someone breathe, like saying, "You are not forgotten." Jennifer Dera's great-grandfather is buried somewhere in that field. His name was John Nitter. He died at Eloise from tuberculosis in 1918 at the age of 31. His wife and sister came to identify the body but could not afford to bury him. As Dera said, just because you are poor does not mean you do not deserve the dignity of being marked and having someone say, "I was here, I was someone." The cemetery tells us exactly what Eloise was. Not a hospital, not a sanctuary. It was a machine that processed people who had run out of options. That machine did not care whether you were anonymous or famous. It consumed everyone the same way. Elijah McCoy was the son of escaped slaves who had fled Kentucky through the Underground Railroad. Trained as a mechanical engineer in Edinburgh, Scotland, he returned to America brilliant and certified, and no company would hire him because he was black. Instead of practicing engineering, he took a job shoveling coal on the Michigan Central Railroad. In a makeshift workshop, he invented an automatic lubricating cup that oiled steam engine parts while the locomotive was still in motion. He patented it in 1872. It revolutionized the railroad industry. When imitators flooded the market, engineers reportedly insisted on the original. They wanted the real McCoy. Over his lifetime, McCoy filed 57 patents, but he sold most of them for fractions of their value because no one would back a black inventor. Other men became millionaires from his work. In 1922, McCoy and his wife Mary were in a car accident. Mary died. Elijah never recovered. By 1928, his savings gone and his mind failing from dementia, he entered the Eloise Infirmary, the poorhouse, the place where people went when nothing was left. He died there on October 10, 1929. He was 85 years old, alone. The man whose name became synonymous with authenticity spent his final year in a county home for the destitute. After Eloise stopped swallowing the living, it kept consuming the dead. The psychiatric division began closing in 1977. The General Hospital shut its doors in 1984, and then the demolition started. Most of the 75 buildings were razed by the mid-80s. The iconic smokestack with the word Eloise emblazoned in brick was demolished in 2006. The bakery was gutted by arson in 2016. 902 acres of institutional grounds were carved up and sold. Strip malls went up. Condominiums, a golf course, a Kroger supermarket now sits on land where patients once worked the farm. In 2018, Wayne County sold the remaining Eloise property to developers. The price was $1. $1 for 143 years of human suffering. The K. Beard Building, one of the last original structures, was converted into a commercial haunted attraction. Every Halloween, actors in costumes jump out at paying customers in the same hallways where real patients once screamed for help. The decision triggered outrage from people who remembered what had actually happened inside those walls. A columnist who had covered Eloise's final days as a young reporter wrote that real pain stalked its hallways and real abuses were inflicted on the most vulnerable and forgotten members of society. He asked whether we have no respect for the memory of those whose lives were made wretched by a system that treated the mentally ill as guinea pigs. A former aide to the governor of Michigan, whose own mother had been admitted to Eloise, said using it as a haunted house made him angry beyond words. A mental health advocate started a petition, writing that had she been born before deinstitutionalization, she would have ended up in exactly these kinds of facilities. In 2009, a Washington Post editor named Steve Luxenberg published a book called Annie's Ghosts. After his mother's death, he discovered she had a secret sister named Annie Cohen, committed to Eloise at the age of 21 in 1940. Annie spent 31 years institutionalized. Her own sister spent nearly 60 years pretending she did not exist. The shame of mental illness in America was so powerful that families did not just abandon their relatives to places like Eloise. They erased them. They rewrote their own histories as if those people had never been born. That was the final function of Eloise. Not just to warehouse the unwanted, not just to treat them or mistreat them or bury them under numbered blocks, but to make them disappear so completely that even the people who loved them could pretend they had never existed. 7,100 people are buried in a field in Westland, Michigan, under numbered blocks with no names. Burial records for entire years are missing, and where the largest psychiatric facility in the country once stood, there is now a shopping center, a golf course, and a haunted house. We filled it with people no one wanted. We buried them without their names, and then we paved over the evidence and charged admission to walk through what was left. This has been Ward Files.